I just hate YouTube videos that waste my time with unimportant things, and I have no plans to waste your time with unimportant things. What I'm going to talk about today is the most important thing that you can investigate for your life and for the lives of your children. And it's to understand what's going on in the world today. Now, I've put together a few notes here that I'm going to be looking at to guide me through this. And the Bible says that the truth shall set you free. Well, what I'm going to be talking about is truth. Now, I believe, and I've written a book that deals with this, that God's law will set you free. God's law leads a people to prosperity. And the name of my book is God's Law, the Only Political Solution. Now, I want to give you some examples just briefly of how God's law leads to prosperity. One of the laws is thou shalt not steal. A society that enforces that law motivates people to be productive. Because if a society doesn't protect private property rights, there's no reason for people to produce. And if people don't produce, the society is poor because it's productivity that causes prosperity. So that's why communism and socialism have always been failures, because they steal people's productivity. And when a government steals productivity or allows people to steal other people's productivity, the people can't prosper. Another one of the 10 Commandments is, thou shalt not bear false witness. If people aren't truthful with one another, if contracts are not kept and enforced, society can't prosper. So that's another example of how God's law, the 10 Commandments, brings prosperity. And I could talk about each of the commandments and talk about how each of them leads to a prosperous nation. But I'm just going to focus on those two right now. Now, I want to visit with you just a little bit about the theory of cognitive dissonance. What that theory says is, if we believe something to be true and are confronted with something totally different from that, we'll just reject it out of hand. We'll say, well, that's crazy. I'm not going to listen to that. And what I'm going to talk to you about today, you're probably going to say that. And that is that the greatest harm to human civilization in all of history has been banking. Now, I know most people will say, well, I'll turn this off. This is crazy at this point. But hear me out. And I think you will learn something that maybe you didn't know before. Now, why do I say that banking is negative? As a matter of fact, I believe has caused more human suffering than any other practice ever engaged in all of human history. Well, I'll explain that to you. First of all, I want to say this. The reason I'm making this is friends have said, Charlie, you got to get this word out to people. People just don't understand what is being done to them. So I'm going to try and give an explanation of that. I'm almost 70 now. What I'm sharing with you, I learned when I was 27 years old. And as a result of that, my life has been a war. I've been rejected by people, been called crazy, and I've studied this issue of banking for all those years. Worked on an MBA at one time and completed law school, became a lawyer, wrote a book, and the focus of my life for all those years has been to expose the evil of banking. And that's what I'm going to do in this. Okay, now first of all, I want to talk to you about how I got interested in this. As a kid growing up in St. Louis, in grade school, I took a field trip to the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. And that got me interested in the subject. And Then the next thing was when I was in college, I took a course in economics. Now I want to tell you that I couldn't make any sense out of economics. It made no sense to me whatsoever. And then we had a guest speaker that came one day and spent an hour in class with us. And his name was Darrell Francis, and he was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. And he just said a few things, and with what he said, all of a sudden, all of economics came into focus, and I completely understood economics. And before that, it was totally absurd to me. And what did he say? He said that inflation is an increase in the supply of money and credit. So when we see rising prices, it's not caused by labor unions or Arab oil or anything else. Rising prices are due to an increase in the money supply. And with that key, I could understand all of economics. Now, I want to say that understanding this issue is important to understanding everything that's going on in society today. We see the hatred of Donald Trump as president. Why? Why is he so hated? It's because the international bankers despise him so much because he is a threat to their power. Now, what's their goal? Their goal is the enslavement of all of humanity. So they have the power to exterminate any individual or population group whenever they desire. They want all of humanity to be their absolute slaves. Now, it was the international bankers, specifically the Rothschild family, that financed the communist revolution. See, they viewed communism as a means for them to take control of all means of production. And with control of all means of production, they could control everything. It wasn't enough for them to be able to control the creation of money. They wanted to control everything. Now today, the spokesman, or mouthpiece, I should say, for the Rothschild family, who are the head of the international bankers, is George Soros. If you hear George Soros saying anything, you can be assured that what he is saying is what the Rothschilds want. One of the key issues he has is his open borders society. He wants no borders. In other words, he wants a one world government. Now the UN, the European Union, all these globalist organizations are designed to give the international bankers complete control over the people of the earth. And George Soros is his spokesman. Now, I want you to think about this. George Soros claims to be a Jew. And during World War II, when he was only 14, 15 years of age, he collaborated with the Nazis to turn Jews over to them. Now, the Rothschilds claimed to be Jews, but they financed Adolf Hitler. Why is that? Because what they do, the more Jews are persecuted, and they claim to be Jews. Now, whether that's a legitimate claim or not, I'm not going to go into that in this video. But then they can claim that if you criticize them in any way, that you're anti-Semitic, and you are criticizing the most persecuted people on earth. But the more they persecute Jews, the more they can claim that they're persecuted, and so we can't criticize anything they do. That's the game that's being played. Now, I want to say this. When I started to tell you events that piqued my interest in banking. When I was working on an MBA at the University of Missouri at St. Louis, a friend of mine gave me a book by a man by the name of Merrill Jenkins. Now, Merrill Jenkins was an interesting guy. As a kid, he was a coin collector. But then when he grew up, he became a mechanical engineer, and he worked for a company in St. Louis by the name of National Reject. Now, they made coin changers. The dollar changer was his invention. And while the Federal Reserve banks were telling us that the new money, which I will call sandwich money, it's made out of copper sandwiched between two layers of nickel. Now that's the only money you see today. While they were introducing that money, they had Merrill Jenkins build them a machine that could separate silver coins from that sandwich money. And they installed those machines in all the Federal Reserve banks, and they pulled the silver out of circulation as quick as they could. Well, the fact that this was going on got Merrill Jenkins thinking, and he started to investigate money. And he wrote the book, Money, the Greatest Hoax on Earth. When I got this book, and I was 27 at the time, working on an MBA, I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. I read all night long. And I thought, if this is true, this changes everything on earth. And as I studied and through the years have spent my life studying this, it is true. And the truth is that banks create money out of nothing. Now, I just say to you, if you were to go on the internet and type in, do banks create money? You'll immediately pull up site after site that will say, banks don't really create money out of nothing. Banks loan out their excess reserves. But you know, in those websites, they never really define for you what excess reserves are. And in this presentation, I will explain to you what excess reserves are and show you how banks create money out of nothing and loan it into existence and then charge you interest on what they created out of nothing. Now I'm looking at my notes here. I want to share with you some quotes on money, and they're from my book, God's Law, the Only Political Solution. Now, I'm just going to read you a few quotes on money out of my book. Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes its laws. Meyer Amschel Bauer Rothschild of London. The few who can understand the system will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. While on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantage that capital derives from the system, will bear its burdens without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interests. That's from the Rothschild brothers of London. Now, this is from President Thomas Jefferson. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Now, this is another one. This is from President John Adams. All the perplexities, confusion, and distress in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, so much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. This one's from my favorite president, President Andrew Jackson. If Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, It was given them to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations. Now, this next quote's from President Abraham Lincoln. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who question its methods or throw light upon its crimes. Now, this is a good point to mention this. The Federal Reserve, the central bank that issues our nation's currency, which is privately owned, was created in 1913. Now, you would think that the entity that creates our nation's money supply would regularly be audited. Would you care to guess how many times the Fed has been audited? Try never. It has never been audited. What corporation could go over 100 years without ever being audited? That ought to tell you right there that there's something very wrong with our monetary system. Okay, this is also from President Abraham Lincoln. The people can and will be furnished with a currency as safe as their own government. Money will cease to be master and will become the servant of humanity. Democracy will rise superior to the money power. Abraham Lincoln did issue U.S. currency. It was called the Lincoln Greenbacks. That's how we financed the Civil War. Now, I could read quote after quote, but I just want to read one last quote because I think it really sums up the money issue better than any other. This is from Sir Josiah Stamp. He was president of the Bank of England, and he said this while speaking at the University of Texas in 1927. By the way, he was said to be the second richest man in Great Britain. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money. And with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for then this world would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be the slaves of the bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. Now I'm going to move back to my notes here. Now I just want to share with you a little bit. I've got actually a grandnephew, not a nephew. He's my nephew's son. He just graduated from college with a degree in money and banking, and he's taken a job with a bank. And I asked him, I said, where does money come from? And he said, well, the government creates it. Well, now this is a kid that just got a degree in money and banking. And I said, oh, that's interesting. If the government creates our money, why is the government so deep in debt? Now I want you to think about that. If you could create money, would you be in debt? Well, the truth is our government does not create our money supply. Our money supply is created by the privately owned Federal Reserve banking system. Now, there's 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. Each of those are owned by the member commercial banks in their district. Now, those banks subscribe to stock in their particular regional Fed, and they are paid interest on that stock. I believe the statutory rate right now is 6% interest. I think at times it's been as high as 8, but it varies, okay? But anyway, they make money off of the stock they own in the Fed. Now, why is it that this issue of where money comes from is so unknown in our society? Well, I want you to think about this. If you could create money out of nothing and loan it into existence at interest, don't you think you could be fairly wealthy? Do you think you might be able to own the best politicians money can buy? Why is it we don't hear any politician, except for maybe Ron Paul talked about it a little bit, but most politicians never talk about this? Why is that? Anybody that is talking about this subject will never get anywhere in politics, because the news media, which is also controlled by the bankers, will destroy them. They will tell lies about them. They will do everything they can to make sure they never get any credibility or get elected. Also think about this. If you can create money out of nothing, you could own our educational system. If money is really created by bankers, as I say it is, why doesn't every high school student learn that in high school? It's because someone who controls our educational system does not want us to know that truth. Now, another thing is, I've found as I visit with bankers that most bankers don't even know that banks create money. Now that may sound crazy to you, and maybe they're lying to me when they say, oh no, my bank doesn't create money. And that's what they'll tell you. Although I've had a few that admit it and actually know how the system works. But most will tell you, oh no, my bank just loans out its excess reserves. That's the answer you're going to get most of the time. But we don't understand what excess reserves are. And that's why we don't understand how banking works. I want you to just think about your town. What are the biggest, nicest buildings in town? It's always the banks, isn't it? It's because banking is very profitable. Creating money out of nothing and loaning it into existence at interest is very profitable. Well, where did this system come from? In my book, God's Law, the Only Political Solution, by the way, which is available on Amazon as a Kindle book, or you can get it from me by emailing me at charlesrfuquay@gmail.com. I sell them for $20 a copy. Anyway, if you want to know where this system comes from, in my book I give an example that I get from Paul Nadler. Paul Nadler was the advisor to the American Banking Association, and he gives an example of the goldsmiths of the Middle Ages and how they created money. Now, what I'm going to explain to you today is it actually predates the goldsmiths, and it really talks about where banking originated. And the origin of banking is Babylon. All historians that have studied this subject are in agreement on that. Banking originated in Babylon. Now, how did it work? Well, in Babylon, the money or medium of exchange was grain, wheat. If you wanted to make a purchase, you'd take the appropriate amount of wheat to, say, the shoemaker. He'd make you a pair of shoes, and you'd give him wheat. Well, in Babylon, there was a grain bank, a place where people could store grain. People would deposit their grain in the grain bank, and the grain banker would give them a receipt for the grain. Now, over time, the tendency developed that when people wanted to spend their grain, rather than taking the receipt back to the grain banker and getting the grain and spending the grain, they'd simply spend the receipt. It was as good as grain. They could take it to the grain banker and get grain for it. So the receipts that the grain banker issued began to circulate through the Babylonian economy as if they were the money or medium of exchange. Well, now the grain banker was an enterprising guy. At times, he would loan out his own grain at interest. Say somebody needed grain to plant, they could go to the grain banker, borrow a little grain, say, hey, I'll borrow 10 bushel of grain from you now, and at harvest time I'll repay you 11 bushel. He could earn a little interest of his grain. Well, one day somebody came to the grain banker and wanted to borrow some grain. But he told the grain banker, I don't need this grain to plant, and I'm not going to eat it. I need it to spend. So rather than actually give me the grain, could you just give me a receipt for the grain? Because people accept that. It's as good as money or the medium of exchange. So the grain banker thought, you know what? People continually spend my receipts. Who would know if I had more receipts outstanding for grain than I have grain? So what he did, he sat down and he wrote out a second receipt for a unit of grain that already had a receipt outstanding for it. 2 receipts for 1 unit of grain. Now I want to ask you, was that honest? Was it truthful? I would submit to you that it was not. Now what the grain banker learned was that if he had a substantial supply of grain, he could loan out several receipts for every unit of grain. Let's just say he loaned out 5 receipts for every unit of grain he had. That would mean that the reserve ratio was 1 to 5. And as long as he didn't lend out more than 5 receipts for every unit of grain he had, he is living within the reserve ratio, and he is loaning out his excess reserves, because he came to learn that most of the people weren't going to bring the receipts back at the same time and demand grain for them. Now, if there was a rumor, hey, I don't think the grain banker can redeem all of his receipts, and if people started to believe that rumor, there would be a run on the bank. And people would discover that the grain banker couldn't redeem all his receipts because he had more receipts outstanding than he had grain. But now over time, the grain banker got very wealthy. He actually started loaning money to the king. And the king used his military force to defend the grain banker, who supplied him with money. So over time, people were not allowed to redeem their receipts for grain. And that's the system we have today. Our money used to say redeemable in gold or silver. Today, our money, the Federal Reserve notes we carry around, and if you're interested to know who issues those, notice what it says on it. It does not say United States government note, redeemable in gold or silver. It says Federal Reserve note, legal tender for all debts, public and private. Now let's talk about how money comes into existence today. Well, the way it works is the federal government deficit spends. It spends more money than it takes in taxes. Well, when it does that, it goes to the Federal Reserve banking system and it says, hey, loan us some money. So the Federal Reserve banking system credits the government's account. They get a bond from the federal government, an interest-bearing bond, and they loan the money to the government. The government uses the money to pay its debts. It pays a private in the army, pays a road contractor, welfare check, whatever. And then the Federal Reserve, privately owned Federal Reserve, gets this interest-bearing bond. The people are then taxed to pay the Federal Reserve banks the interest on the bond. Now, I want you to think on a few things here. Why do we do this? If the government can issue a bond, why couldn't they just issue money directly? Well, if they do that, the bankers don't make money on it. Okay, there's a second level of money creation in the United States. The first level is when the federal government borrows from the Fed. The second level is when the people borrow from the commercial banks. The money that the Fed lends to the government eventually winds up in the hands of the people. The people take that money and they deposit it in what's known as demand deposit accounts, checking accounts. They deposit that money in checking accounts. Okay, the reserve ratio has been anywhere from 1 to 5 to 1 to 10. The government, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve can set that reserve ratio, and the banks follow it closely. And they can loan out, say the reserve ratio is 1 to 5. For their average daily balance in checking accounts, they can loan out 5 times as much money as their average daily balance. So what they're doing is they are creating money just like the Babylonian grain banker did. And they're loaning it into existence. Now, that money will have to be paid back to the commercial banker plus interest. Now, when a person pays the commercial banker back, I want you to think back on the Babylonian grain banker and think about if he was paid back. If he was paid back, he could be paid back in one of 2 methods. He could be paid back either in grain, and then he had more excess reserves to loan out, make loans on, or he could be paid back in his own receipts. Now, if he's paid back in his own receipts, what are those worth to him? Nothing. He just tears them up and throws them away. And from a publication printed by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York called Money, Master or Servant, we see this quote: "Banks create and destroy money in their everyday operations. They create money when they make loans. The money is destroyed when the loan is repaid." But I want you to think about what the bank got from that money it created out of its excess reserves. Basically created the money out of nothing. It earned interest on that money. Now, all money comes into existence in one of 2 ways: when the federal government borrows from the Federal Reserve banks, or when the people borrow from commercial banks. All money in existence is loaned into existence at interest. All money in existence must be paid back to the money creator plus interest. That means that more money must always be paid back than was created. Well, how can that happen? The only way that can happen is that the money supply must constantly be expanded to create the interest as it comes due. Now, what happens if the money supply is not expanded rapidly enough? We have recession. That means that some percentage of people that owe loans are not going to be able to get the interest on that loan to pay back to the bank. Now, the Federal Reserve can cause those. The Great Depression's a good example to that. They contracted the money supply. In other words, they slowed the creation of new money creation. And when that happened, people couldn't get that interest to pay back the banks. And so the whole system collapsed. Now, if they create ample synthetic money rapidly, we have inflation. Now, all my life, and I'm almost 70, we've lived in an inflationary time. We live in an inflationary time right now. The money supply is constantly expanding to pay interest as it comes due. Now, I want you to think about that. As the government and the people fall deeper and deeper in debt, and that is the situation, both public and private debt are higher than they've ever been in all of American history. So as people fall further in debt and as inflation continues, what's happening? The savings of elderly people, retired people, is constantly eroding due to inflation. And we are laying ever increasing debt on future generations. This is a terrible system. Now, I want you to think about this. If bankers make their money or earn their income by loaning money to governments, for example, what's the most important activity for governments to engage in? Anything that causes deficit spending. What causes more deficit spending than anything? War. War is a wonderful thing for the bankers. What else? What about welfare programs that don't help anybody? Those are also wonderful things for the government to engage in. And that's why we see our politicians constantly do stupid things, because all those stupid things that they do are beneficial to the bankers. Remember, if you can create money out of nothing, you can buy the best politicians money can buy. And most of them are for sale for campaign cash. Now, I hope that gives you a understanding or overview of our money system. Pass this on to people. I think it was President Andrew Jackson that said, if the people understood banking, there would be revolution in the streets before tomorrow morning. But most people say, hey, give me a glass of beer and a football game to watch and let me occupy myself with things that are not important and I'll be happy. Quit being dumb and happy. You need to learn about the things that really affect your life, and this is one of them. Again, my book is available on Amazon as a Kindle book. It's God's Law, the Only Political Solution. Or you can get it by sending me an email to charlesrfuquay@gmail.com. And I charge $20 for the book. Pass this on to people. It is so important that people understand what banks are doing to us. Thank you.